Welcome. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor of Russian studies and joined today by Alexander Mercouris of the very informative and extremely popular the Duran podcast. And the guest today is the very renowned Indian diplomat and writer, Mr. Bhadrakumar. And Bhadrakumar has 3 decades long career in diplomacy as a diplomat, in which he served in places like the Soviet Union, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. He was ambassador to Uzbekistan, Turkey. Effectively, yes, all-knowing. And many of our viewers as well are probably also very familiar with his current excellent writing in the Indian Punchline, which is, I would say, an absolute necessity to read, which offers this very great analysis, which we all get to get some of the insights also from his decades experience in diplomacy. So, I just want to say welcome, Mr. Bhadrakumar. It's a great privilege to have you on.
Thank you, Professor. It's really an honor and a privilege. I regard it that way, and I appreciate that you have invited me to join you for a discussion of this kind, which is featured a lot of people, enlightened people, and I feel rather humbled that I've been included in the list of invitees.
Thank you. So I thought today the main purpose is to discuss India's position in this emerging multipolar world. So, well, first, how does India position itself in the conflict between NATO and Russia, which has produced this war in Ukraine, but also what's the nature of India's relations with Russia, India, the United States, India and China, which also is a tense relationship. So many would see India as becoming this indispensable partner in this Russian-Chinese sponsored Greater Eurasian Partnership, but we also see that India is a very vital partner for the US-led Pacific region. So India seems to have a balancing role in the international system. Anyways, I thought we could start with the larger picture, which is this transition from unipolarity, that is the international system under US control, to more multipolar world. Because on this topic, I would have to say, speaking to an Indian diplomat such as yourself is always interesting, as India, of course, was the largest non-aligned state during the Cold War, and you have successfully maintained your independent foreign policy posture, even though you might not agree with everything India is doing these days, which we would also like to delve into. But it's not an easy position to take, this independent, as these days everything is framed within, with us or against us, and every conflict is framed as good versus evil. I would say, at least here in Europe, we see that the unipolar order or hegemonic system is often framed in the language of values, so liberal hegemony. So the loss of hegemony means loss of liberal values. So any political imagination, I would say, about how to organize the world in a multipolar framework, it's met with a lot of distrust. So again, I think the Indian perspective is very interesting, as the marketplace for ideas appears to be much larger. So I wanted to get a better understanding of how you, as well as India, see these efforts of repositioning India in a multipolar world. Simply, well, for example, in the West, we recognize that the G7 is no longer capable of leading the world, so we have the G20. But we can't control the G20, so we prefer to stick with the G7. So this is our challenge, I think. We stuck between the ideal world of the 90s versus, ideal for hegemony, versus the realities of today, which is multipolar. So I was hoping, can you share your thoughts? What are the main challenges as well as opportunities in this transition to a multipolar world from an Indian perspective?
Well, let me begin with the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the post-Cold War phase. When the rest of the world was, by and large, the rest of the world was caught up, was mesmerized by this so-called unipolar moment. This was the phenomenon in the 1990s. India didn't really buy into that. I'm making a point here that the transition is not very difficult for India. I'll come to that later. I'll explain that later. In my perspective, when I look back, in the first, the Soviet Union collapsed or disintegrated or disbanded, whatever, and the Cold War ended, and the bipolarity ended, and the United States established its supremacy in a way unchallenged. That never took place in modern history. The first decade of the Cold War. But you see, India's experience is different insofar as the first term of Bill Clinton. The United States didn't make the transition into the post-Cold War phase vis-a-vis India. That was a time when Russia was dominated by the Westerners. Ivanov as foreign minister and so on in the beginning of the Yeltsin era. The Russians were not allowed to send the cryogenic engines to India. It created friction between the United States and India because the United States blocked it. Because it just couldn't get over the fact that India didn't cooperate during the Cold War era. So this is the nearest, that the United States could do to, quote unquote, punish India. So they blocked the cryogenic engines transfer to India. And the first term of Bill Clinton, the American policy literally didn't change. It was in the second term, Clinton's second term, that the first stirrings began to appear. Now, my estimation is that it was less geopolitical and more economic. Because in the early 1990s, if you know the history of India's economic history, for the first time, we took to the market in a big way. The so-called liberalization under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was at that time the finance minister of India. And the growth rate picked up from the so-called Hindu growth rate, which is 2%, 3%, and so on, started increasing. And steadily, the economy started picking up momentum. So you see, the Americans saw that the potential that if this is sustained in the Indian market, this is going to be a very important market for business. I think it was a very significant consideration, coupled with other things, because, you may have read Stroke Albert's book on presidential diplomacy, when he was the point person for the Russian Federation, post-Soviet era. There he mentioned that, by the 1990s, middle of the 1990s, the Americans perceived that there is a kind of resentment building up in the Russian mind. The first term of Yeltsin was ending. There's a very graphic description in that book at that time about, because the air was full of talk about Zhuganov probably winning that election and defeating Yeltsin. And then Yeltsin and Clinton and Talbot came to Moscow. So that portion of the book, his memoirs, that portion, that crucial visit where they decided to pump in a lot of money into the Russian economy and give American expertise in, you can call it manipulating or in finessing election campaigns in a way to suit Yeltsin's re-election bid. So you see, that phase in the book when it is described there, this is just before the NATO expansion and all came, and in fact the NATO expansion is also linked to this. That was the time. Clinton says, at one time that that he is not a Russian expert or anything like that, but the gut instinct of a politician tells him that the Russians are not liking it, what has been happening. And he used an expletive, a word which I don't want to repeat. He said, so much we are shoving down their throat. And one of these days they are going to throw up. And, this was the time that Yeltsin was preparing his momentous visit to China. and on the border settlement and so on. So the Americans understood that by that time already, this Russian expectation that they will be part of a common Western home and all that is sheer fantasy, that they are not going to be admitted into that. So what I'm saying is the American perception towards India would have had a geopolitical angle to it also. But from the Indian perspective, we never really got hooked to the unipolar predicament. God is in the heaven, and Americans are there, and if so long as you have them as friends, there's nothing to worry about. That sort of a predicament, and everyone flocking to the Americans, that was not there. We needed the relationship with the US. We needed very badly, there's no doubt about it, technology, capital, and it is that kind of an outlook was in sync with the liberalization of the economy that was taking place, all that. So, the transition to multipolarity, to come back to the theme that you introduced, I don't think that there is any kind of a ellipsis there, intellectually, in the diplomatic sphere, so on. India's transition was rather smooth because India was a non-aligned country. And there were times we had differences with the Soviets, such as the intervention in Afghanistan. We couldn't agree with what happened, and we had very serious misgivings about the intervention as such. So it's just one telling example I'm giving. And there are times, the Americans hated it, our attitudes on issues such as Vietnam War and so on. So you see, from that time onward, when you look at it, the strategic autonomy is a concept that is embedded in the Indian psyche. And if you really want to understand it, then you have to go to the roots of India's freedom struggle. And, the intellectual content into the freedom struggle, the connectivity with the Indian nation, with the Indian people, was the profound contribution of Mahatma Gandhi. But, the intellectual content of it, Nehru visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s, 30s. You must understand it. He was educated in England. He was in the circle of Professor Lasky, and, that kind of a intellectual upbringing he had. So, he was an internationalist of that kind. And these concepts are his contribution, basically, because, when you look at it, the range of countries the newly independent countries which came through national liberation struggle or freedom struggle, whatever, the post-colonial era, how many countries took this kind of an attitude, as India did? So, it's embedded in the, and if you really sit back and reflect on it, multipolarity has a very big, what can I say, a very big intellectual stream of non-alignment in it. If you reflect on it, you will see, I have thought about it. Multipolarity and non-alignment are like Siamese twins. You cannot separate them. So you see, we were, in that sense, I would say something very audacious, which is that we were used to multipolarity in the Cold War era also. So there is not going to be, this is not a traumatic experience for India. And India's devotion to multipolarity is therefore very authentic. I don't think it is like, for example, to illustrate a point, and you are all erudite minds, so I just mentioned the country's name and you would know where I'm getting it. It's not like Turkey's, for example, so it's different. So India as a practitioner of multipolarity is unique in my perception. And this is something which startled the Americans when, the question of sanctions against Russia came up, at that time. And then people looked at it in terms of, Russian oil being sold at a discount and so on. That is belittling it. It goes beyond that. And even today, for example, India could, do things, the G20 summit, which is coming up in a very different way. But India is not doing that. India is taking a very, very correct middle line. And India is chairmanship. And India is going about it with that kind of a frame of mind of a strategically autonomous country. Maybe there may not be a joint statement. Maybe there may be a joint statement if we are lucky enough. That's not the issue. The issue is how we are handling it. So you see, all these things, what do they show? They show that India is genuinely a, a, a practitioner of multipolarity. It has been for a long time, and it will continue to be there. And it will be a fallacy on the part of any big power to think that India can be tied and it's locked in. India can be locked in. It's not possible.
I think that I find that most interesting. Can I just ask? There's something that I was thinking as you were speaking, which is that, in a sense, India's position and its history is unique and explains a great deal about the the importance that India has in the non-aligned movement before and in the multipolar system that is emerging. In the sense that India shares with a lot of the global South the experience of Western imperialism, but it emerged out of that period of Western imperialism almost immediately as a great power. I mean, India was an important force even in the 1950s, the 1960s. Nehru was a major international statesman, so was Indira Gandhi. And even today, and even increasingly today, India remains, as I said, a major force in international affairs. It also has, of course, a very, very long history. In fact, arguably, perhaps even the longest history as a civilizational state, which again is unique amongst the states that broke free from Western imperial control. So that also gives it a degree of understanding of, imperialism, and at the same time, a sense of confidence in its handling of it, which none of the other states that came together and formed the non-aligned movement in the 1950s have ever had. I remember the period of the Cold War very well, and it was already widely understood in Britain, where I used to live, well, where I lived, but I mean, I was living there as well, that India was, in effect, the leader of the non-aligned movement. Not, nominally, there never was such a thing as a leader, but it was always understood that India was, to a great extent, the biggest force within it, and the one that made non-alignment for the other countries that came together to form this non-aligned movement. It was India's involvement in it that made non-alignment during the Cold War a viable option. So you have this understanding of the West simultaneously with this tremendous self-confidence that comes from being both a great power and a great power with this extraordinary history going back millennia, thousands of years, which no other country to the same degree can perhaps match.
I thought, sorry.
Well, to pick up the thread, this I agree with what Mr. Mercouris has said. I agree with it. The fact of the matter is that that there was a major discord with the United States in the first decade of the post-Cold War when India went nuclear, and Clinton came down like a ton of bricks, sanctioned India, and said that India is not going to be able to get out of this foxhole. He said his expression, for a long time. That is, we will be condemned, as a pariah state. This is what his first reaction was. He was so furious. Then within months, the re-engagement began. When it was understood that India's considerations are so very central to its national interests, there was no question of India retracting from this, from what it has done. And it was done without any consultation with the Americans. American intelligence failed also to detect it. And all this, when the world was, mesmerized by the unipolar moment. This is one aspect of it. But the point which Mr. Mercouris said, I must also introduce another stream there, which is this: that I mentioned that the non-alignment and the multipolarity, strategic autonomy, these are all different facets of what India had been practicing. But at the same time, we also have our Westerners. Though India was a colony, British colony, and we had a very bitter experience, so it didn't last for long, but even then it was bad enough. And the kind of exploitation which took place and the humiliation, national humiliation, and so on, this is all very much there. And even today in the social media, it reappears one way or another. When some odd statement is made from London or Washington, immediately there is an explosive reaction from the common Indian, who articulating his feelings. But at the same time, a statesman like Nehru also was profoundly influenced by Western Enlightenment. And it's a fact. And we felt, our elite felt at least, and we, in the sense I'm speaking about the country's elite, they felt, that they were one with the Western world in terms of values, freedom of expression. And when the making of the Indian Constitution, for example, we dipped into the Western constitutions, and we borrowed ideas freely from there. India was never a democracy in that sense, but there is a Western democratic experiment, Western democracy, and the values attached to the Western democracy that you will find all over the Indian Constitution. So you see, there is always going to be a discomfort if India is disowned by the West or despised by the West. There is always going to be a discontent. That's not what India is seeking. The imperialism part is there. India may find it very very disgusted, with certain things that are happening. But it keeps its thought to itself most of the time. You may have noticed it doesn't hit out like that. This Quran burning, for example, of this kind of thing happening. I'm not even talking about the present government. I'm talking about generally about India. Now, therefore, you must also see this, that the Westernism, when you say Westernism in the Russian context, for instance, it has a different connotation. But when I say Westernism in the Indian context, there's nothing repugnant about it. The values and the whole package, is something that the Indian leaders had dipped deep into it, had imbibed it, and those values and those ideals were incorporated into the freedom struggle in very many ways. So you see, that is also something which we have to see. So India is not, in other words, an anti-Western country. India cannot be. India will never be. There may be hiccups, but ultimately the Indian desire will be to be working with the Western world, to cohabitate with the Western world, so on. And whether I wrote yesterday about Myanmar. Myanmar is a telling example. India is unable to go along with the West, when it comes to Myanmar. And India has a very different thing. And but for the differences with China, it's a country where I feel, for example, India would have worked happily with China to stabilize the Myanmar situation. So it's an Indian is not a one-dimensional man. There's you have to keep that in mind. The friendship with the Soviet Union, we have not touched on it. This, I think, the Soviet Union never experienced from any of its allies the kind of friendship that they stuck with us, and it is something which I saw from very close quarters. So and then as years passed, it became part of a legend in India, the Indo-Soviet friendship, and it began to be felt in the blood. You know, that is the other part of it. So it's very complex. The Indian practice and Indian concept of strategic autonomy. Everything is going into it.
I think the most important point that you made is that, of course, India is not an anti-Western country and has no desire to be, and that is not in its conception at all. But we come back to Western policy at the present time, which is that the West finds it very, very difficult to accept that a country can be well disposed to the West and not always agree with the West at the same time. So that if we're talking about the conflict in Ukraine, for example, which perhaps we should touch on, the West is very exasperated with India at the moment because India is not agreeing with the West in imposing sanctions. It continues without friendship with Russia. It maintains its own position of making its own decisions and having its own opinions on that conflict as it is generally about world affairs. So to me, always, and this, by the way, is not a new thing. I can remember it during the Cold War as well. I can remember it when, for example, Brezhnev visited India back in the 1980s, not long after the conflict with Afghanistan, which, as you correctly said, the Indian government disapproved of. But the West is never happy when it sees India act in that way. Just as if you go back and you read American statements and media commentaries, all the way back to the Bandung Conference, to India's role in setting up the non aligned movement. If you look at the time of Nehru's visit to Moscow, they were not happy with that either. They couldn't understand it. They didn't understand why a country that shares so many of their values nonetheless wants to and is in fact determined to pursue its independent line and say to the West, to the Americans in particular, we think you're wrong about this, or we have our own perspective and we're entitled to have it. And we're not prepared simply to adopt your own. And to my mind, that is the major cause of friction, both in relations between India and the United States and the West, but also, to say frankly, between the United States and many other countries.
See, the Russia or the Soviet Union was very different in that respect. The Russians were never prescriptive toward India, and even when the relationship was so tight and so much more strategic than it is today, I can say with some certainty. If you look at that period in the 60s and 70s, even there, the Soviets never dictated. And the Soviets gave a lot of space for India to work out things its own way. I'm sure you are aware that at the time of the East Pakistan crisis, leading to the creation of Bangladesh, the Soviets had felt very uneasy about it, what we were doing, because this has never happened in history, that you go and slice and cut up a country into two different halves and make another country out of it. It's so it's something which is which is uh, which is not accepted, at all in international life. And the Russians had a sense of uneasiness about it. But then, when India explained its situation, and it became quite clear that India had very weighty considerations of its own, the Russians backed us to the hilt. So the difference between the US and the USSR is in this respect, that the Americans have, exactly as you said, have this complex that either you go along with us, or there is a problem between us. But for the Soviets, you find, for example, even in this Africa summit, you see how the Soviets and the Russians handled it. I find that their package on Ukraine, for example, has got elements, which are not going to be acceptable for the Russians. There are certain elements there, and so these contradictions are there. But even if so, in other words, the Russians do not expect that all contradictions have to be resolved, and you have to, from A to Z, you have to be on the same page, and then only you can have a partnership. That kind of a freedom India enjoyed in the past and still continues to enjoy with the Russian Federation. That is the difference there.
I'm reminded to some extent about Turkey, because this is also how we often react to Turkey now that they're attempting to position themselves a bit like India as an autonomous pole of power in the international system. Because whenever you hear politicians or the media discuss, it's always, well, what are they doing? Are they aligning with Russia or aligning with us? Again, there's always the assumption that they will bandwagon behind someone else and choose which block to follow. So the idea that that's what I meant, the whole idea of multipolarity, in which some countries establish themselves as autonomous centers of power, not fitting into the us with us or against us. It's very difficult, I think, in the political culture to accept, especially after the unipolar era, where there was either with us or against us as well. So. But I want to switch a little bit to Europe, because I think, well, for India had the experience of being a non-aligned state, both in the Cold War and the unipolar era, and it might be easier. But I think for the Europeans, the unipolar era was more dramatic, because for us it signaled multipolarity meant we were going to follow, develop this pan-European security architecture according to the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. Unipolarity meant NATO expansion, which, in the words of George Kennan, would mean we would restart the Cold War, because we would effectively cancel the common peace with Russia. So this is obviously, at least in my opinion, a key source of the difficulties now between NATO and Russia, and subsequently this war we have in Ukraine. I was just wondering, how do you see the conflict? In Ukraine playing out, on how would it lead, not merely on the battlefield, but in terms of political settlements?
The important thing is to have an understanding of the American game plan. That is very central. It's a lot of opinions are there on that score, but let me give my perception. Frankly, I don't think that it suits Biden to have a settlement before November next year. That is my reading of the situation. I will argue this way, that if you have a settlement, and if Ukraine it's not very easy, it will be a long drawn out negotiation and so on. The fighting stops and long drawn out negotiations and so on. But if this stops at this time, the fighting and all this, then the campaign in the US will dwell on other issues. You see the point? And first of all, the corruption charges, the state of the economy, all those things, immigration, and all those things come up there. And I don't know whether Biden has enough on the plate to show, to structure a positive election campaign, a positive agenda for the election campaign. So it suits him. And as a politician and an experienced politician who's capable of working the system to his advantage, unlike Obama, for example, or Trump, for example, he knows the potentials of this war, for his own politics. And I think that is going to be a very major determinant. And so long as the American boots are not there on the ground, I think it will be exceedingly foolish on his part to do it. And I really think he means it when he says that, there's no question of putting American boots on the ground. So long as American boots are not on the ground in Ukraine, this can be an open-ended thing for all you know for the US. And it can easily continue like this till November. And then when it is happening, then it is a question of news cycles. It's a question of media management and so on. And it's a question of almost like a president who's fighting a war, but he's not fighting a war. His body bags are not coming. But this is in focus. For the whole Western world also, this would be in focus. So it's going to suit him that way. And I think it will be very simplistic on our part to imagine that negotiations leading to a settlement is something that the Americans are looking for. That is my assumption. Because you look at it from the Russian side, this is not a territorial question. This is not a question of, that Russia should go back to such and such a date, Russian forces. It's not like that. We know very well that this is also about European security. This is about NATO expansion. And yesterday I saw the Russian clippings, at least, of Lavrov's remarks about Russian, obviously on the basis of intelligence inputs, that there are going to be deployments now very soon in Finland and along the border. And he threatened yesterday that Russia will react, So it could be, I don't know in what way it could be. But it was a very stark message. So this is the way that things are going. And how can there be a settlement when the West is not going to accommodate Russia's, the legitimacy of Russia's interests, security interests, defense interests? There's no meeting point there, So the gap is so enormous, it cannot be negotiated at all. That is the second part of it. And then the third part is this: that I don't know whether any leadership in Moscow now will be able to roll back what has happened. It's like unmaking an omelette. It's not possible. And the expectations within Russia, I find I was wrong, but there is a certain council of support even for Wagner. That kind of thing is all there. So you see, it's very difficult for the leadership also to hold back and say that that we must compromise on these issues and so on. There is a scope for compromise because the regime in Kiev, it is not interested at all either. Because the moment there is a settlement of that kind, it needs to give way to a legitimate representative government there, isn't it? If there is a settlement. And does anyone think that these people are representing the country, that they have a mandate to rule. They are not. So interest groups are there also in Kiev, to see that this doesn't happen. So I am of the view that depending on the kind of escalation, on the escalation ladder, depending on what happens, in the first lot, I am afraid that the Russian operations may expand and may at least come to somewhere around the Dnieper River, and the areas there. And beyond that, nobody knows if the Poland is going to act in a way that Putin has said that they have plans. Then see, this kind of escalation may force the Russians that may be having no alternative but to go all the way to the Polish border. It's quite possible. How can, if Poland comes in, for example, Belarus is very seriously threatened. Its security. And the regions, as you know very well, the history, the regions adjacent to Belarus, even Ukraine, Belarus will not allow Poland to occupy those areas. And already it is covered on one side by Lithuania and another side by Poland. So how do you see it?
I was going to say, there's an article, I think it was last week in New York Times, which, seems to confirm, at least agree with what you're saying, because I think, Alexander, you probably read the same. It was argued that this war has been a great windfall for the West. So it called the war actually a big success, and it was based on, to some extent, what you said. That is, Russia has been bled, or they said that Russia has been rocked as a strategic adversary. Furthermore, then NATO has begun to expand with getting in both Finland, but also soon Sweden, and furthermore, disconnecting Europe from Russia was also a great victory for the U.S. in the New York Times, especially Germany, which they said had been going too close to the Russians, and now they had rediscovered their values, to direct quote, the article essentially pointed out the war has been a success pretty much in every way, except for the Ukrainians, of course. And so I guess if a settlement would come now, some of these successes could be rolled back. The Germans could reconnect energy with the Russians, some of the, I guess, obedience they now have from the Europeans after many years of the EU attempting to go its own way. All of this could unravel if the war comes to an end as well. So, sorry, I think I interrupted you, Alexander.
No, I was going to say that I'm afraid I'm somebody who very much wants to see an end to the war, and I look every day. I look for some signs that there's going to be some negotiation, some kind of talks, and I cling to the fact that you get interesting articles in Foreign Policy from time to time, rumors of people talking in Moscow, and which I think are more than rumors, but ultimately, and I've come round to, I think I said that in my last program, I've come round to the very bleak view that Mr. Bhadrakumar has, which is that I don't see any incentive, any political incentive for President Biden to seek peace at this present time, other than possible fear that there might be a complete military defeat for Ukraine, and that might be something that he wants to avoid. And I don't think he's reached that point, or the people around him have reached that point. When they think that, I think that the kind of concessions that the United States would have to make to Russia in order to achieve peace in Ukraine are unacceptable to the United States, to President Biden personally, and I think that it wouldn't just divert attention, rather bring back attention to the domestic issues, which I think Mr. Bhadrakumar is absolutely right about. But I think it would also create more avenues for criticism against Biden in the forthcoming elections. So I'm sorry to say I think there are people in the United States who understand or who feel that in the long term, this war will not or may not turn out to America's advantage, and they are saying as much. But they are not the group that is in the ascendant within this administration, and they do not articulate the president's view. So I'm afraid I've come around very much to that bleak perspective as well. And I'm afraid also from the Russian side, I think again, Mr. Bhadrakumar is spot on. Everything that I have seen in Russia is that there is now a settled determination to see this thing through to its conclusion. And we had that extraordinary dynamic because we were just talking about Western Ukraine and Poland intervening there. So we have a meeting in Moscow, which is a public meeting. We have the cameras there, and uh, Putin and his intelligence chief Narishkin discussed the possibility of Poland moving into Western Ukraine. And Putin says, "Well, we don't like it. It's a terrible idea, but if they do it, well, it's none of our business." And then the following day, literally the day after, Lukashenko comes along and says, "Well, hold on. It's not their business. It's also our business. Because if the Poles move into Western Ukraine, we in Belarus are threatened. We are insecure. And we can't allow that. That's unacceptable to us. And if people in Western Ukraine call on us for help, we will come to their help. And we need to know that you in Russia support us in this." So we see how even when the Russians, even when Putin perhaps gives a hint that he might want to disengage, the immediate countervailing pressures, which are supported. I mean, Lukashenko in this, I think, was supported in Russian society, become too strong and pull him back, if you like, towards a more escalatory outcome. So I think we're trapped in a pattern of escalation. And I do hope that you're right that we're not going to see American boots on the ground. I think that's absolutely the president's wish. But for the moment, I have to say, I don't see any sign that negotiations are really going to bear fruit. I think that it would require something much more dramatic to happen in Ukraine itself um, for the policy in Washington to change. And even then, I sometimes wonder whether the president, it might be easier for him to see a defeat for Ukraine rather than a negotiated solution in which it is he who is making the concessions. He can always, after all, try and find some way on blaming a defeat on his opponents. So that's a rather long comment, but I'm afraid overall, I think you're probably right.
But even I just want to add, even if this is the defeat for Ukraine might be preferred, it doesn't really explain, I think, NATO policies. I mean, the recent statement in Vilnius, or almost on a daily basis, that as soon as this conflict is over, Ukraine will join NATO. I mean, this if you look at the incentives this creates for Russia, if we accept that the Russians consider this an existential threat, what we're effectively telling the Russians is you should take whatever you can now of Ukrainian territory and destroy the rest, make it a basket case, because what remains of Ukraine will be our new front line against you. I mean, it just looks like a horrific policy. It's destruction of a nation. So I don't know. I simply don't understand this. Why? Perhaps Mr. Bhadrakumar, you could help, because I don't understand how what these statements achieve, because it seems to only remove any aspect of negotiations. Because if there would be any settlement, the most important component would be some form of neutrality. So, but it seems like this is taken off the table already, which then only leads perpetual war. It seems as the alternative.
I think the Vilnius summit is like you're on a journey and a halfway station, where you just stop. We will get a better picture only with the summit in the US next year. By the time we will know where we stand definitively on this issue. But from the American remarks and Biden's remarks, really rather candid, and also the European opinion as a whole, I can't see how there can be a consensus within the NATO for Ukraine's induction. It's not on the cards, you know. So that's not much of an issue there, and therefore the noises that we heard from Vilnius are in terms of grappling with the kind of disunity and the cracks which appear in the NATO, to paper over that, to form a kind of a single line of thought. You know, they presented it and they moved on. Because in the run-up to that, you found, you know, that really there are cracks developing within NATO. So that I don't know whether that is the issue. The issue is, you know, that look at it like this: that if the United States concedes Russia's legitimate interests, security interests, and I use the word carefully, I think they're very legitimate, because in a similar situation, the United States wouldn't act any differently. I think India wouldn't act differently if put in a situation like this. So there are legitimate interests, and United States doesn't have any kind of stakes, direct stakes in it. You know, it's 10,000 kilometers away, and its national security is not impaired as a result of it that Russians are accommodated in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. So, you know, why the Americans are doing that? Americans are doing that, of course, this agenda of weakening Russia, dismembering Russia, it's not fiction. It has been there all along, and there's no running away from that reality. And you can ask, why should the Americans think on these lines? Well, that's up to them. But there are enough people who think on those lines. And you remember, for example, Madeleine Albright, when after she retired from the position of Secretary of State, she got that assignment to prepare a study on NATO's future. You know, what is called that out-of-area operations. That idea, that concept. So she developed that concept. You know, that is basically speaking, NATO coming out of the European theater as a global security organization, and as something which, you know, is even superseding the United Nations in its global reach. You know, acts independently, takes its decisions independently, without a UN Security Council mandate. So when she prepared it, she prepared that report, and at that time, one of the remarks she made was very interesting. You know, that that it is it's very improper that a single country can monopolize so much of resources in the world. You know, so you know this is the thing that is bugging. When you look at Europe, when you look at Russia, you find when you look at the Western world and when you look at Russia, Western world is singularly lacking in resources. You know, and we saw that, for instance, you know, the enrichment, you know, the empowerment, the colonial era, the logic behind the colonial era, you know, the transfer of wealth and transfer of resources were needed there for building up this sort of prosperous societies, economies. But Russia, on the other hand, you know, Russia now is sitting on such vast resources, you know, which could last for decades, centuries, you know, that kind of thing. So this could be the motivation, you know, which is there, because ultimately everything comes to that of creation of wealth, you know. So it must be that. So that is one aspect of it. And the second aspect, which I think is more important, perhaps, and in the current situation, is this: that the United States is declining, and it will have if in a normal situation in Europe, if normalcy is re-established in Europe, and diplomacy comes back into vogue, and you know, a war and all those things become a thing of the past. What happens to the United States is transatlantic leadership. I don't think that leadership is anymore necessary, because Russia will interact bilaterally with the European countries. And any number of European countries are interested in it. Not only Viktor Orban, when Germans, for instance, Germans had a thriving relationship with the thousands of German companies were operating in Russia. And for German economy, all they need is there next door in Russia, for the German industry. So you see, if that happens, then what is the logic of NATO? What do you do with NATO? And NATO, you must understand that NATO is a captive market for American weaponry, and we don't get to hear it, but an enormous amount of backup for the US arms industry is because there is this NATO market there, and interoperability is the rubric under which these transactions are taking place. Mind-boggling figures, of this kind of thing taking place. That is one thing. And secondly, that the United States can never exercise its power globally without the backup of an alliance system. And if the alliance system is not there, it becomes a nation state. It cannot go and fight wars, and it cannot. It goes with the allies, and that is why Biden came back and revived, the transatlantic dialogue. But now, if the relations with Russia are normalized, if peace reappears and Russia is accommodated in Europe, then where is the need for United States as far as the European countries are concerned? Where is the need for what is the logic for NATO? And then how do the Americans exercise their power globally? So, the point is, it's not very simple as you think, that just with a change of heart, these issues can be resolved. No, it will not be like that. Because there are some, these contradictions are very fundamental, and they're very difficult to reconcile these contradictions. And so long as they are there, Russians have experienced it, that this unfulfilled promises, broken promises, blatant lies, doublespeak, all this has been a whole chronicle of this in terms of their experience with the Western world. And they are fed up with it, Now, probably at the time of the end of the Cold War and the disbandment of the Soviet Union, like it often had happened in European history, they should have probably distilled all this in some treaties or some such thing. Nothing exists, as you know. One era ended, another began, and nothing in terms of to show, even about the NATO expansion. It is hotly debated, where the fact is that, enough to show that an assurance was given to the Soviet leader by none other than James Baker, by Chancellor Kohl and others, So on that basis only, the Cold War was actually, the end of the Cold War didn't happen accidentally. It was a negotiated process. And at the end of it, there was no treaty to put it all, codify it all. This is the problem there today. So Americans, in other words, to round it off, Americans cannot concede these legitimate interests of Russia. And it's they know very well it's not a territorial question. Professor, one thing I want to say, one thing there, that, this devastating Ukraine, you've lived in Russia, isn't it? Huh? It will be very difficult for a Russian army to go and, this scorched earth policy in Ukraine. It's not, they won't do that. It's like, it's like the mother, if you go back to their literature, their history, it's like mother. You just can't do, even if the mother has been, careless and all that. You can't do that to your mother. It's like it's so very sacrosanct. But if at all they go into Western Ukraine, the Russian forces, it would be because of the stupidity of the Americans, leaving them no alternative but to do that and to go up to the Polish border and be finished with it once and for all. But given the choice, the Russians would gladly settle if their legitimate interests are accommodated.
A Russian once told me about the immense difficulty for Russians of, say, carrying out a kind of bombing of Kiev similar to the kind of bombing that happened in Baghdad. Um, she said to me that for us, it would be like bombing our own capital because that is what once upon a time in the past Kiev was. And we have this connection to Kiev, to Ukraine, that is still very important to us. And we can't just let it go. It's an emotional thing. But can I say, I was listening to all that you were saying, very interesting, and I think you make powerful and true points that, in a sense, negotiating a compromise, not just a compromise over Ukraine, but a compromise over the general situation in Europe might be perilous for the American global strategic position. It might, in fact, argue that America should become a nation state, which I've actually read Americans who say this is the danger. We don't want to be that. We don't want to be that kind of a country. But of course, one can understand the rationale for the Americans. What is very troubling is that as Europeans, which is what uh, Professor Diesen and I both are, this is in effect Europe sacrificing itself or being sacrificed in order to preserve not just American interests, but an American conception of itself. And it's extraordinary to me, and I have to say this, it's extraordinary to me that Europeans have allowed themselves to be led along in this way into this into this situation, that Germany has sacrificed its economic relationship with Russia, which is working very well. And not just an economic relationship. If you know Germany, I know Germany quite well. I have family there. How strong interconnections between Germany and Russia was starting to become. Austria, even more so in some ways. Other places in Eastern Europe, and and in the Mediterranean world. How easily and quickly we forfeited all of that in support of American objectives, which are ultimately of no concern to us. I mean, if the Americans have, issues about the fact that they might lose their position, they might lose NATO, they might lose the great strategic advantages that all that confers and their self-image. Well, ultimately, why are we making that problem, the Americans' problem, into our problem by going along with these ruinous policies? Once upon a time, during the early period of the Cold War, the Americans brought prosperity to Europe. They brought a kind of security, at least to Western Europe, or at least that was the perception. Now, it seems to me that they become almost predatory in the sense that they brought war and they've also brought economic recession and dislocation and problems which it's difficult to see now how they can be solved. I mean, is this something that India people in India perceive? Do they? And how do they feel about this? How do they feel about how Europe is responding to this particular crisis?
Well, we see lots of double standards here.
Yeah.
In the European position also, lots of double standards, double speak, and experiences. We have had unsavory experiences also. So we are not inclined to take at face value the European position. You know, the Indian relationship with European countries are mostly on a bilateral basis. Predominantly bilateral, and it's not across the European continent. We don't have strong relationships with many countries, but with some countries we have, particularly with France. We have UK, of course, traditional relationship, but France otherwise. So, the Indian approach is not in terms of a European position. Indian approach is in terms of Prime Minister was in France, and there is a certain appreciation in India. I don't agree with that. That French are like Indians; they practice strategic autonomy. but I have my differences with that. I think Macron is. So, but within the paradigm, certainly there is a merit in the argument that the French are different, in terms of having their own assessments and their own estimations about global happenings, about regional conflicts, and so on. Ultimately, they fall in line, the NATO line, they fall in line with that. But that is there. We find some comfort level there. That's how it is. Otherwise, European position as such is not, I don't think it is something that India takes cognizance of, in a significant way. But
I mean,
sorry.
That is extremely sad. I mean, for a European to hear, actually, because, I mean, we still perhaps conceive of ourselves in Europe, not perhaps as the center of the world as we once believed ourselves to be, but at least a very important part of it. And to hear from, certainly an important Indian commentator, a former diplomat, a former senior diplomat, that, perhaps we're not taken especially seriously anymore. It's rather humbling and perhaps for some Europeans a bit depressing.
But just to add very quickly what Alexandra said, I mean, this further subordination now, this is, it has to be pointed out that the retired German general Harald Kuyat, he's the former head of the German Bundeswehr. He was also the former chairman of NATO's military committee. He's been out in the media saying that America provoking this war and obstructing or sabotaging any possibilities for negotiations has he says it's been in a way an attack on Germany, because now they've they made themselves vulnerable to Russian retaliation. Also, of course, their economy will now be shattered, and their political dependence now on the United States, as well as security dependence, it completely subordinates them. And again, this is a General Kuyat, and not even me speaking. So it is a dramatic thing. But I just want to also switch gears a little bit before we run out of time, because I wanted to focus a bit on China as well. Because, well, as we're on the topic of Germany, the historical role, if you will, expressed by the British and then the Americans have always been to keep, the industrial might of Germany away from the resource powerful Russians, because if they come together, that would effectively remove or at least weaken British and then American power. But in doing so now, the Russians have found a new Germany. Germany on steroids, which is China, obviously, with their industrial might. So it seems that this is become a bit of exercise in self-harm to push these two giants together. But I'm thinking from India's perspective, how is India seeing this rise of China? Because on one hand, it's a reality which has to be addressed, but also it's I guess a tense relationship. So we see, for example, India working with the Chinese in BRICS. On the other hand, perhaps India is not as comfortable with developing a common currency under the BRICS, as this would then maybe facilitate excessive Chinese power. I know that the Russians have formulated it as they're content with seeing China as the leading power in Asia, but they don't want it to be dominant, which is one of the reasons why the Russians really want a greater role for India, as it would. China would still be the largest one, but they wouldn't be able to dominate. But I'm just wondering, how is the Indian perspective on this? Because this is a very complicated relationship between China and India. in this new multipolar framework?
You're absolutely right. When you touch on any of these issues, ultimately things have come to this, sadly, that we address the issue through the prism of India-China relationship. It has come to that actually. In any sphere, you find China factor. In the Indian foreign policy and diplomacy. Our navy is now, one of the ships I saw in the picture in the Indian press is loitering around somewhere in the Pacific Islands. We have no interest there, no stakes there, but China is there. This is a kind of thing that is developing. And the Americans are encouraging us also to think and act on these lines. The border issue is, in my feeling, is possible to be resolved, but the Indian narrative is a contrived narrative. It's a self-serving narrative, self-righteous narrative. And when you go for a fair and just settlement, compromise is needed. But a compromise becomes not possible because the public mood is set in concrete, and because this is a narrative which is half a century old, and it has not been touched by any government. It has gone on like that. The point is, I had a feeling when the Modi government came to power, because the war with China was not its legacy. The border dispute was not the legacy of the present ruling party. So I had a feeling that Mr. Modi might take a different look at it, because when you are not carrying baggage of that kind from the past, you can start afresh. So logically, but that doesn't happen because probably it is because the nationalist platform doesn't allow it. The compulsions working on the present leadership. Number two, there will be an enormous amount of resistance from within the Indian establishment, the permanent establishment, and also the political class, and the Indian polity is very much polarized today. It's nothing, nowhere can we claim to have a national consensus today. The polarization is so acute today. So all these factors make it a very gloomy picture, the India-China relations. And this government, my own thinking is that, that when you have differences, United States also has differences with China, but it has engagement with China also. Even Kerry was there recently, So on issues where, you need to work with China or you have to work with China, you must work with China. But after the last border situation of couple of years back, the government has decided that unless that is fully resolved, there is no forward movement possible on other fronts in the relationship. Now, having taken that attitude, now going back on that is going to be very difficult, So at least this year and next year, second half, till next year, second half, nothing can change because we have election coming up, general election in May next year. And the government cannot be seen as pulling back from that, from the present stance. So it will be probably towards the end of next year only that a fresh look is possible, depending on the elections and what kind of government we are going to have after the elections. The interest is very much there in having a relationship with China. It is not that India is has a close mind on China. That Mr. Modi himself has been to China a few times, 4 times or something, before he became Prime Minister. So one would assume that he knows China. its potential to be a contributor, a collaborator, a partner country for India's economy. All those things are there. When things degenerate like this between the United States and China, all said, on the other hand, I don't think India will take a role in it. India is not going to get entangled in it. In my assessment, India will not get entangled in it if things hot up in the Indo-Pacific region. When it comes to Russia-China relationship, initially there were misgivings in the Indian mind that this may work against India. But I think the comfort level has gone up, and we are probably we are able to live with the fact that the Russia-China relationship has touched a very high level today, and but it doesn't have to be necessarily against Indian interests, because the Russians have not behaved anything in any way that way, and the trust and mutual confidence in the India-Russia relationship is, I think, is substantially there, and especially at the leadership level. And let us see then how these things work out. The border is quiet on the whole, and I would imagine that it is also in Russia's interest, in China's interest to see that peace and tranquility continues there. Why this incident took place 2 years, 3 years ago is a matter of dispute. China thinks that India precipitated the situation. India thinks that China unilaterally violated the understanding reached between the two countries to keep the border stable. So that is a debatable point, and I'm sure there is not going to be much of a meeting point in the near future. I'm afraid.
I have to say, in my opinion, the Chinese-Indian relationship is in some ways the most important potential relationship in the world. If this can be sorted out, the impact will be enormous. I mean, we were talking about the fact that the Russians and the Germans have a mutual interests in working together, and how well it would work out for them if they did. And the Chinese Indian one would be that on orders of magnitude greater scale. So, and the other thing is that India and China have actually worked together very well in the past. I mean, there was a time, I'm sure you know, that in the 1950s, they seemed to be actually quite good friends. And Zhou Enlai and Pandit Nehru, they seemed to get on extremely well. And there was a period of time when the two countries seemed to be working together in world affairs. And then in the 60s, the early 60s, it all went horribly wrong. And we've never quite got over this. Is it the border dispute or institutional factors in India that are holding a rapprochement back? Or is it something deeper? Is it that there's commercial interests who are saying that we want to align more with the United States as opposed to with China? Or is it a sense of fear of the colossus to the east? I mean, I can't imagine that a country like India, a huge country, really needs to be afraid of China. But I mean, what is driving the India? I mean, there's obviously a Chinese side, which I'm not at all familiar with. But what is the Indian reticence in seeking this relationship with China? Is it purely institutional, purely a legacy thing, or is it something else? Is it something deeper than that? I just quickly add, the Russians, of course, also had very difficult relations with China, but they resolved them. They resolved their border dispute quite quite cleanly. And I think it became very clear then that it was essentially an institutional conflict rather than a deeper one. But what about the Indian one? What is the factor that's holding India back from seeking a full engagement with China?
You see, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian presence and the Russian activities on Indian soil, they were on retreat. They went into hibernation. And leaving the field open for the Americans. American think tanks came in a big way. A lot of attention was being paid to India. Interest groups have developed. To sum it up, interest groups have developed in India. My own, recently an American commentator, a senior American analyst wrote, in fact, that British analyst wrote that ODYSEE is British, and wrote that the Indian military, for example, is heavily influenced by American thinking. Is pro-American. They have written from the Western assessment. They are saying, I don't know, but there must be something to it, So this kind of thing. Then the point is, that there is a very large non-resident Indian community in the United States. And now they are socially, politically, they have kinship with the Indian elite. And they have influence, and I'm sure the Americans use them to influence the Indian decision makers. This is another aspect of it. You see, the point is the Indo-Pacific strategy cannot have a traction. I am not boasting as an Indian, but objectively, when I look at it, the Indo-Pacific strategy is a non-starter without some kind of role for India in it. And in the sense that India has to be a fixture there, it's very important. It's not a question of whether Indian ships will go and fight to defend Taiwan or anything like that. It's not like that at all. It is that, that simply there is this India factor there, And so Americans go all out to complicate the relationship between India and China, to reshape the atmosphere, and use their contacts here with the political class, think tanks, media, military, security establishment to keep fueling this animus against China. I don't think that any Indian with common sense would any longer be imagining that India is in rivalry with China, because it has an economy which is 4 to 5 times what size of India's. And that kind of a situation as it prevailed in the 1990s, beginning of 1990s, is long gone forever, And even if Indian economy does extraordinarily well, you see, in a matter of just a handful of years, China is adding one more Indian economy to its size, to its kitty, So that race is not there, and India-China race is not there. But the spirit of animus against China is very much there, and militaries could be also because of the war in 1962. The humiliation that it suffered at that time. I don't know whether this is all insurmountable. A strong leadership, like after the elections, for example, if Mr. Modi comes now, I'm just reflecting and purely a freewheeling as an opinion maker. I'm not speaking for anyone else. But if he gets a new mandate and he's at the peak of his political career, and as a statesman, it will be just about time that he starts thinking about his legacy. If he wants, he can address this issue. And it's an issue where he can leave his mark. Because basically, unless India gets this relationship straightened out, its diplomacy and foreign policy cannot be optimal. And it will be hobbled, So that realization, because India can then, with China, a normalization with China, India can explore frontiers in a way that it cannot do that today, So my only hope is that after the next election, things may change.
Is China doing something wrong with India? I mean, is there something about Chinese policy, the way the Chinese respond and act towards India, which instead of building
alert from system of solar, no battery.
Can I just interrupt you? I find
alert from Apple battery monitor, no battery.
The battery has to be reconnected. Can I stop for a minute?
Yes.
I'll just get back. I need to get the power line and reconnect it.
Sure. Sorry for the short break. Alexander, you were in the middle of a question.
No, what I was going to ask is, because we agree that this is an important relationship for India, but also for China, because, of course, China has a very strong interest, one would assume, in restoring, in settling its relationship with India. Are the Chinese doing something wrong in the way that they approach India? Do they perhaps trample on Indian sensibilities in some ways, aggravate things where it might be in their interests to calm them down? I do wonder, because I do sometimes feel that the Chinese are not always the best diplomats in these sort of situations.
Well, I don't think the Chinese policies are so much India-centric. Policies even in South Asia. India-centric, as some Indians believe this, in fact, that they tend to see every move that China makes as having as something with an eye on India. I think that is completely unwarranted. It's a sort of paranoia that India can do without, as you said, being a large country, it can afford to have more self-confidence. That is my view of it. But in Sri Lanka, for example, China has not pursued that way a policy to instigate the Sri Lankans against India. The relationship with Bangladesh, they are handling independently. The Belt and Road is a very big instrument for them in Bangladesh, and they are working on it. And but it is not with a zero-sum mindset. There has been some kind of a friction in Nepal, but the problem is this: that from the Indian perspective, China has a larger-than-life presence, and that is the whole problem. And therefore, anything that China does in India's neighborhood is immediately taken as something, which impacts India's interests negatively. And I keep thinking about this also, the question that you asked. I can't see any activities which are directed against India. China has, of course, a very, very close relationship with Pakistan. But that is something which, two countries are entitled to. And Pakistan, for example, is also a very special partner for China. I don't think China has any partner like Pakistan. This is like something like the USSR had with India, the kind of relationship that is there. That is, as sovereign states, they are entitled to have that relationship. But is China again instigating Pakistan against India to go for a war with India or to open a second front or to fuel insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir? I don't think that is happening. On the other hand, the Chinese statements at least are that is towards India and Pakistan resuming their dialogue and sorting out their differences bilaterally. And they look at Kashmir problem as something left over from history, which is something that India can live with. So it's difficult to say. The present point is, the present moment is a moment of estrangement, acute estrangement, that nothing is happening. Like a $1 billion investment offer from China for making electric cars in India. $1 billion is a very substantial investment. India just said no to it. So you see, that is what I said, that in international diplomacy, if you have a problem with a country, your effort should be to engage with that country. This is my plea, and without jeopardizing our core interests, it is possible for India to use China's rise and China's expertise and China's capital and investments and so on for the benefit of the Indian economy. And why we are not doing that is my whole submission. The problem with the border also is this, that it's a unsolvable problem really, because it's also about creation of a border where none existed previously. And so it's going to be very, very difficult.
I like your optimism, or not optimism, but a positive view in terms of the need to harmonize the interests of these, two Asian giants. It wouldn't just be good for China and India, but also it would be a huge stabilizing factor for the rest of the Eurasian space. And but I also share Alexander's concern about this the border disputes as this. Well, it's not just a thorn in the side of both, but it's also something that obviously can be exploited, especially for anyone seeking to build an anti-China alliance. Aggravating this conflict obviously is a key tool towards building such an alliance. Before we round off, any final comments from Alexander or you, sir?
Well, yeah. Well, can I just explore one very last issue? Because of course, the relationship between China, Russia, and India is in some way a triangular one. And I noticed that Mr. Bhadrakumar spoke about, that there was this decline in Russian presence and influence in India after the Soviet Union collapsed, and perhaps, certainly the Russians wanted to grow again. They're now very keen to develop strong relations, economic, financial relations with India, which go beyond the oil trade, and there is a potential there. And you were talking about how in India there is this enormous feeling towards Russia because of the long history. Russians that I know, and I'm not talking now about people who are in politics or in diplomacy or in the government, that same feeling towards India exists in Russia. I can say that absolutely. If you're talking about ordinary Russians, they have an enormously positive feeling about India. So if the Russian-Indian connection were to get stronger, given that Russia has a friendly relationship with China, and it's a relationship that China is keen to preserve, could that help this help the India and China sort of come closer together again? Because can I just say, to come back, there is no conceivable way, in my opinion, that the Russians would sacrifice their relationship with India to please China. That is simply not going to happen.
Yes, I thoroughly agree with you that I mentioned also that initially there was a certain degree of paranoia which was built up also by China's detractors in the West, the think tanks and media writings and so on, that this will work against India, the proximity developing between Russia and China. But now I think the comfort level is quite significantly there, and India is not perturbed by that. But to come back to what you said about how far can Russia be helpful, uh, I already see that Russia is being very helpful wherever it can possibly, to 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 get the two sides, India, China, working together. In whether it's in the framework of BRICS or SCO or anywhere for that matter. Russia has not made it much of an issue about India's membership of Quad. Russia has expressed unhappiness that Quad is trying to divide Asia, and that is a Cold War mentality and all that. But there has been no direct criticism of India there. And China also, my feeling is that Chinese writings in the recent period at least, Chinese writings are simply looking at Quad as not something very consequential, the basically, you see, the thing is this, that that I feel that the difficulty lies in a strong leadership, and sometimes a strong leadership has to take difficult decisions, and then get the country to accept those decisions in the interest of the country's medium and long-term interests. Now, I'm afraid India hasn't had that relationship, that kind of a leadership. Whether if India has that kind of a leadership, whether China will reciprocate is another aspect of it. Because you see, the sovereignty question now for China is also extremely important in the context of Taiwan and so on. So, to what extent the Chinese leadership also is capable of making compromises and showing flexibility, one doesn't know. Whether it is. I cannot speak for China, but in the case of India, I can say this, that I have the confidence that India hasn't had such a strong leader as Modi for quite some time, and the likelihood is that he will be the prime minister for a third term after the election. This is my personal assessment, and I've been reflecting on this, and I think that it is logical that a leader of his stature going into the history books will want to create some legacy, and in international affairs. And it is not a legacy that, he interacted with the successive American presidents or anything like that, but something very substantial for the country. And this is a central thing for Indian foreign policy and diplomacy, that as a prime minister, he normalized this relationship and put it back on track. So this is a legacy that will be remembered by the country for a long, long time, for decades altogether, that Modi did it. So potential for that exists, in my opinion, but it will have to wait for the next election. Unfortunately, all these Ukraine thing and everything came now, right now, at a time when India is also preparing for. Actually, a number of states are preparing for election shortly, and an election cycle is beginning, and then it reaches a crescendo in the general election in May. Yeah? So this is the way it is. So I find that now, for after about another 6 to 8 weeks, everything will come to a halt in India. and life will be in terms of it. And you can imagine what a mammoth effort it is, to get a mandate from such a huge country to rule this country for another 5 years. So the politicians and Modi would be really busy with that part of it. So let us not, therefore, debate over it for the time being. This is something which will have to be looked at for new openings and new stirrings in the second half of next year.
Yeah. Well, with that, I just want to thank you both for your time.
Thank you to Mr. Bhadrakumar for that clear, comprehensive, and thorough and wonderful answer.
Thank you. It's been my privilege, Professor Diesen, and can I call you Alexander?
You can, of course.
So, because I'm telling this to you, you really made a whole world of difference to my understanding of the day-to-day developments, and enormous reach of information that you have. So all I need to do is in Ukraine, if I have missed anything, to just listen to it. And I keep telling my friends here also, I'm sure you have a lot of Indian followers, because
that is wonderful to hear.
Yeah,
thank you for those very kind words again.
Tell me that, and that 1 hour, 20 minutes, 1 hour, 15 minutes, if I can listen to you every day, it brings me abreast of events in Russia, Ukraine. That's why. So it's a great honor. It's a privilege that you invited me and that I could be with you for so long. Thank you very much for
thank you very much.
Thank you.